When the guns finally fell silent over Europe in the spring of 1945, the world was left to take stock of the ruins. Cities were flattened, armies exhausted, and the moral order of civilization itself had been shattered. But amid the rubble and the ash, the advancing Allied soldiers stumbled upon something unexpected. Garages, bunkers, and storage halls filled not with weapons but with cars. German cars. Sleek, strange, and sometimes beautiful machines, hidden away from the chaos that had consumed the continent. To the soldiers who opened those doors, these vehicles were ghosts from another world, remnants of a regime that had worshipped speed, precision, and control. Many of them had never seen such machines before. There were racing cars with polished aluminum bodies, armored staff cars built like fortresses, and delicate prototypes whose engines had never been started. To men who had spent years fighting through mud, snow, and bombed-out cities, these discoveries felt surreal. It was as though they had stepped into the private dream of an empire that had collapsed overnight. For some, it was simply loot, another spoil of war. For others, it was a window into the mindset of their defeated enemy, a people who had poured their ingenuity into machines meant to symbolize perfection. The Nazis had long treated the automobile as more than transportation. To them, it was a symbol of ideology, of progress and domination, of a new world engineered by their own vision. Hitler himself had been obsessed with cars. In speeches he spoke of the automobile as a unifying tool for the German people, a device that would connect villages to cities, workers to factories, and citizens to the national purpose. He once declared that the German people must have their own car, one that every family can afford. That dream had produced the Volkswagen project, the so-called people's car. But as the war deepened, it also produced a darker offspring. Vehicles designed not for the people but for conquest. The Allied troops didn't find Volkswagens in those garages. What they found were the other children of that obsession, the machines that the Nazi elite had built for themselves, or for the empire they imagined would last 1,000 years. In one bunker outside Stuttgart, soldiers of the U.S. 7th Army found a row of armored limousines, massive Mercedes-Benz 770Ks, each hand-built for the leadership of the Third Reich. These were the same models that had carried Hitler through his parades in the 1930s, their long hoods gleaming beneath swastika flags, engines purring like restrained beasts. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to excess. Under the hood, supercharged engines delivered nearly 230 horsepower, an enormous figure for the time. The interiors were lined with leather and polished wood, their glass thick enough to stop small arms fire. The soldiers who examined them could still smell the oil and rubber, the faint ghost of the fuel that had once carried men of power through cheering crowds. Some of these cars had been hidden in underground tunnels, their wheels wrapped in tarps, batteries removed. They had been preserved like relics. It was as if their owners believed the Reich might rise again, and they would need their chariots ready. Elsewhere, in barns and workshops, Allied units uncovered an astonishing variety of experimental vehicles, cars and trucks bearing the insignia of Porsche, Mercedes, BMW, Auto Union. These were the companies that had formed the backbone of Germany's automotive might, and their secret projects revealed a civilization that had seen technology as a form of destiny. There were half-tracks, hybrid machines that looked like cars from the front, but tank treads from the rear, designed for the harsh mud of the Eastern Front. There were tiny reconnaissance cars built for paratroopers, so small that 2 men could lift them by hand. There were amphibious vehicles meant to cross rivers and lakes in silence. And then there were the true oddities, jet-powered prototypes, massive 12-cylinder engines mounted in sleek experimental frames, designed not for practicality, but for the pursuit of something closer to perfection. For the Allies, these discoveries were both fascinating and unsettling. They revealed not just the technical ingenuity of the German engineers, but also the obsession that had driven it, an obsession that mirrored the regime's own ambition to dominate. Every curve of metal, every piston, seemed to carry that same cold precision. In one of the warehouses near Munich, a British officer wrote in his diary that the sight of these cars felt like entering a cathedral of machinery. The quietness, the dust, and the strange reverence of it. He described rows of unfinished vehicles, their engines covered in cloth, awaiting a war that had ended before they could serve. Some were mere shells, half-built dreams. Others were perfect and complete, yet destined never to drive again. Among the most prized discoveries were the racing cars, those created for Germany's pre-war dominance of the Grand Prix. Before the war, German engineering had ruled the circuits of Europe with the silver machines of Auto Union and Mercedes-Benz. Their cars had been called Silver Arrows, and they had shattered speed records across the continent, representing the industrial pride of Nazi Germany. Now, in 1945, the Allies found them in pieces, hidden in caves, buried in crates, or stripped for parts. One British engineer recalled finding a disassembled Auto Union Type D, a sleek, aerodynamic bullet capable of reaching nearly 200 miles per hour. Its body panels were stacked against a wall like pieces of sculpture. Its engine, a 16-cylinder marvel, sat nearby on a wooden crate. To him, it was both awe-inspiring and tragic, a symbol of brilliance chained to tyranny. Some of these captured cars were sent back to Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union for study. Engineers wanted to understand what the Germans had achieved, their metallurgy, their suspension systems, their superchargers. In some cases, they learned from them. In others, they surpassed them. The spoils of automotive war were not only trophies, but lessons. As Allied intelligence officers catalogued their finds, a pattern began to emerge. The Nazi approach to the automobile had been a reflection of their broader philosophy: control through design, order through machinery. The leadership had not merely used cars as tools, they had seen them as instruments of national will. When the Allies began to dig deeper into the garages, vaults, and testing grounds of the defeated Reich, what they uncovered was a museum of ambition. There were not only limousines and race cars, but also prototypes that revealed what the future might have looked like had Germany not fallen. Vehicles that seemed decades ahead of their time, streamlined shapes, rear-mounted engines, lightweight alloys. Some were the early experiments of men like Ferdinand Porsche, who had worked on everything from tanks to tiny people's cars. Others bore the fingerprints of designers who had vanished in the chaos, their work interrupted by conscription or death. For every car that looked elegant, there were others that felt almost sinister, utilitarian, angular, designed for efficiency above comfort. It was a glimpse into how the Nazis envisioned mobility for their empire, not personal freedom, but state purpose. The Autobahn itself had been part of that vision, a symbol of speed, modernity, and control, built as much for propaganda as for transport. The same ideology that paved those roads had guided the hands that built the cars. American and British intelligence reports began to circulate, describing these discoveries in almost anthropological detail. The German automobile industry, one report concluded, is not simply a matter of mechanics, but of philosophy. Every component bears evidence of a single organizing idea: mastery. That mastery could be seen in the smallest fittings. the precision of a carburetor, the curve of a fender drawn not by committee but by conviction. In some cases, Allied soldiers would find luxury cars abandoned on roadsides, their owners having fled or been captured. A Mercedes with bullet holes in its doors, a Porsche 853 with its tires slashed to prevent pursuit. These machines, once reserved for the elite, became curiosities for young men far from home. There are photographs of American GIs sitting behind the wheels of these grand vehicles, grinning, posing for cameras. A strange collision of worlds. It was common, in those months after the war, to see Allied convoys rolling through Germany with captured cars at the tail end, not tanks but trophies. A staff officer in a stolen BMW cabriolet. A colonel riding through Bavaria in a commandeered Mercedes, the Nazi insignia hastily pried off the grille. They were symbols not just of victory, but of reversal. The tools of power now in the hands of those who had destroyed it. But for every car that became a souvenir, many more vanished. Some were dismantled by locals scavenging metal to rebuild. Others were lost to the chaos of occupation. Factories were stripped, machinery shipped east or west as reparations. The Allies divided not only territory, but technology. The Americans focused on industrial study, sending teams of engineers to examine what could be adapted or improved. The British took a particular interest in Volkswagen, recognizing its potential as a civilian brand. And the Soviets, who had suffered so much at the hands of German industry, took entire plants piece by piece, reassembling them in their own territory. Yet even amid this organized dismantling, there remained the fascination, the uneasy admiration for what German engineering had achieved under tyranny. The paradox was undeniable. A regime of brutality that had nonetheless produced machines of astonishing refinement. To study those cars was to study that contradiction. In one warehouse outside Berlin, American investigators found a collection of cars that had belonged to high-ranking SS officers. Among them was a custom-built Porsche touring car, painted deep black, with fittings of nickel and silver. Inside the glove box, they discovered a small pistol, a fountain pen, and a half-finished letter. Never sent. The vehicle had been built to convey authority, but now it stood in silence, its owner likely dead or imprisoned. The contrast was almost too perfect. The Allied journalists who toured Germany in the months after surrender wrote about these discoveries with a kind of stunned detachment. The New York Times described garages filled with dream cars from a nightmare nation. The Times of London called them the relics of an empire that built its beauty for war. It was as if the cars themselves had become metaphors, physical embodiments of pride, speed, and ruin. Not all the finds were German. In some seized garages were vehicles that had been captured by the Nazis themselves, French, Czech, and Italian models taken from occupied territories. There were Bugattis and Citroëns from France, Skodas from Czechoslovakia, and Lancias from Italy, all pressed into service by German officers. Some had been repainted, rebadged, and converted for use in the Wehrmacht. Others were stored untouched, as if admired but never driven. One particularly famous discovery occurred near Salzburg, where Allied troops uncovered a cache of cars belonging to the Nazi leadership, including vehicles once used by Göring, Himmler, and other senior figures. Among them was a blue Mercedes convertible, heavily customized, its fittings plated in silver. The Allies quickly recognized its significance and transported it to safety, fearing looters. Over the years, some of these cars would end up in museums, others would quietly disappear into private collections, traded among enthusiasts with the same reverence once reserved for ancient artifacts. But the deeper the Allies looked, the clearer it became that these machines were not random accumulations of wealth. They were reflections of ideology. The Nazi leadership had fetishized motion. They had linked the idea of the automobile to the future of their empire, fast, ordered, unstoppable. In propaganda films of the 1930s, cars were often shown gliding past ranks of workers and soldiers, symbols of unity and progress. When the Allies opened the garages, they found not only cars but those dreams, now still silent and lifeless. There was, however, a strange continuity that emerged from the wreckage. The same factories that had built engines for tanks and staff cars would, within a few years, produce vehicles for peace. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, Opel, all would rise again, their wartime guilt transformed by reconstruction. The Allies, in studying what they had found, inadvertently helped lay the groundwork for the post-war automotive renaissance. And yet, there lingered a sense of unease. For some soldiers, walking among those gleaming machines felt wrong, like trespassing in a mausoleum. These were objects that had served power, even if they were innocent of intent. The fascination was always tempered by the knowledge of what that power had done. An American captain wrote home to his wife in 1946, describing a captured Mercedes he had been assigned for official use. "It runs smoother than anything I've ever driven," he wrote, "and I can't help but feel guilty for liking it." His words captured the strange moral tension of that moment. Admiration and revulsion intertwined. Many of the cars found in Nazi garages were later destroyed, scrapped to make way for the new Germany, but some survived, scattered across continents. A few ended up in museums, the Deutsches Museum in Munich, the Imperial War Museum in London, the Smithsonian in Washington. Others found their way into the hands of collectors, resurfacing decades later with stories half forgotten. Even today, when one of those vehicles appears at an auction or in a documentary, it carries a peculiar aura, a blend of beauty and darkness. They are no longer just machines. They are relics, reminders of the strange coexistence of genius and madness that defined that era. The Allies may have captured the cars, but what they truly uncovered was a mindset, a belief in progress without conscience, design without empathy. In those garages, beneath the dust and tarps, they found not just the spoils of war, but the shape of a civilization that had built its own mythology in metal and chrome. And in the years that followed, as Germany rebuilt and Europe healed, those captured cars faded from memory, their steel recycled, their engines silent. But for a brief moment, in the aftermath of the war, they stood as monuments to a fallen dream, shining reminders that even the most beautiful machines can bear the weight of history. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence agencies began the meticulous process of cataloging everything the Reich had built. There were planes and rockets, weapons and documents. But among the many curiosities tagged and shipped away, the cars always drew a peculiar fascination. To the military mind, they were evidence. To the engineers, they were lessons. To the ordinary soldiers who found them, they were trophies. And to the historians who would later study them, they were metaphors for the contradictions of the age. The marriage of precision and destruction, elegance and brutality. Teams from the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Branch toured factories from Stuttgart to Zwickau, photographing and disassembling what remained. They wrote reports on the use of lightweight alloys, on the development of four-wheel drive systems, on new fuel injection concepts that had been tested but never mass-produced. At the same time, in Britain, engineers from the Ministry of Supply began to arrive in the same ruins, often within days of their American counterparts. Each group was eager to claim what knowledge remained. What began as simple documentation soon became quiet competition, a race to learn from the vanquished. In a hangar near Ingolstadt, British investigators uncovered several half-completed prototypes built by auto union engineers. These were advanced racing cars, mid-engine layouts, tubular frames, aerodynamic shells shaped in wind tunnels. Such concepts would not reappear in mainstream Western racing until the 1950s. The British packed up what they could and sent the cars to England, where they would eventually influence post-war automotive design. The irony was striking. Technologies born in the service of Nazi prestige would later underpin the sports cars of democratic Europe. The Americans, meanwhile, focused on practical engineering. They shipped engines, transmissions, and entire vehicles across the Atlantic for study at proving grounds. Some of these cars, a few Porsche and Mercedes prototypes among them, would end up being examined at the Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Chrysler Engineering Institute. There, mechanics in coveralls probed the German machines with curiosity, trying to understand the metallurgy, the superchargers, the unusual suspension geometries. For them, it was not about ideology, only ingenuity. What worked could be learned from, what failed could be avoided. But there was also another, more human fascination. Soldiers who had spent years fighting an unseen enemy were now seeing the physical fruits of that enemy's imagination. The contrast was hard to ignore. The same society that had produced concentration camps had also produced machines of staggering refinement. A German workshop might have built both an armored staff car and a crematorium furnace, the same precision applied without moral distinction. To walk through those factories in 1945 was to confront the unsettling truth that craftsmanship alone does not define civilization. As Europe began its long recovery, many of these discoveries filtered into public consciousness. Newspapers printed photographs of Allied officers standing beside captured Mercedes and Porsche limousines, their polished hoods reflecting the uniforms of men who had once feared them. Newsreel cameras followed engineers examining Porsche tank prototypes or BMW engines. To the public, it was a glimpse behind the curtain of the Reich's technological myth. These cars became shorthand for the idea that Nazi Germany had combined barbarism with brilliance, a paradox that would haunt its memory for decades. In occupied Germany, a few of the surviving factories were quickly repurposed. The Allies needed vehicles for administration and reconstruction, and they turned to whatever production lines still functioned. Volkswagen's shattered plant in Wolfsburg was one of the first to be revived. Under British supervision, a small number of the people's cars were assembled for military use. The irony of Allied soldiers driving cars conceived under Hitler was not lost on anyone, but practicality outweighed discomfort. The little cars proved reliable, simple, and economical, qualities that would soon make them famous in peace. Elsewhere at BMW and Mercedes, engineers were interrogated and gradually re-employed. They had built engines for aircraft and tanks, but now they were asked to design delivery vans, ambulances, and sedans. The same hands that had shaped the armored vehicles of war now drew the curves of civilian cars. In that transformation lay the story of post-war Europe itself, a continent rebuilding from the ruins of its own ambition. But some machines could not be transformed. In the Alps, Allied patrols discovered garages that had belonged to Nazi officials who had fled in the last days of the war. Inside were rows of luxury cars, often hidden beneath tarps or camouflage netting. Many had been sabotaged, tires slashed, engines filled with sand, to prevent capture. Yet others stood untouched, as if waiting for owners who would never return. A few of these cars bore small personal details: a child's toy in the back seat, a folded map on the dashboard, an officer's cap resting on the wheel. Each told a story of flight, of denial, of a life built around machines that could no longer move. There were also rumors, some true, some exaggerated, of treasure convoys and hidden collections. Tales spread among soldiers of underground garages filled with Hitler's personal vehicles, or of secret SS depots stocked with prototypes meant for the new Europe. While most such stories proved myth, a few remarkable finds did occur. Near Berchtesgaden, American troops discovered several of Hitler's parade cars, including a massive Mercedes 770K with bulletproof glass and armor plating. Another, recovered from Austria, was said to have been used by Göring. These were not ordinary automobiles. They were rolling symbols of authority, stage props of dictatorship. When captured, they became icons of its fall. Some of these cars were displayed for morale purposes. Allied newspapers printed photos of GIs sitting behind the wheels of Hitler's limousine, laughing, cigars in hand. It was propaganda of a different kind, proof that the tools of tyranny now served democracy. Yet there was always an unease behind the smiles. What did it mean to admire something created for evil? The question lingered long after the war ended. In the years immediately following victory, captured cars scattered across the world. Some went to museums or government depots. Others vanished into private hands. A few American officers shipped vehicles home, officially or otherwise. There are records of a Mercedes staff car turning up in Texas in 1947, another in California a few years later. Collectors, often veterans themselves, treated them as relics, strange, uncomfortable souvenirs of a world they had destroyed. Over time, those machines acquired new stories, detached from their origins. A Nazi staff car might become a showpiece at an antique rally, its history reduced to curiosity. Meanwhile, in the Soviet zone, captured German technology took on another role entirely. The Red Army commandeered factories, stripped them of tools and machinery, and reassembled them on Soviet soil. Entire automotive plants were moved eastward, forming the basis for new industries. Engineers who had once designed engines for Mercedes found themselves working under Soviet supervision, their knowledge now serving the state that had crushed theirs. The same process that played out with rockets and jet engines also applied to cars. The quiet transfer of knowledge that would shape the technological landscape of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, most of the physical remnants of Nazi Germany's automotive ambitions were gone, destroyed, rebuilt, or absorbed into new companies. Yet the influence of what the Allies had found lingered. Post-war car design across Europe reflected ideas first tested under the Reich: aerodynamic efficiency, standardized components, integrated production. The dark origins were rarely mentioned, but the lineage was undeniable. Progress, it seemed, could survive even moral collapse. As the decades passed, the story of those captured enemy cars faded from popular memory. They reappeared occasionally, in a museum exhibit, a collector's auction, a documentary photograph. Each time they stirred a mixture of fascination and discomfort. To some they were works of art, to others relics of horror. The tension between beauty and guilt never quite resolved. Yet in another sense, those discoveries symbolized something larger. They were the tangible remains of a belief system that had worshipped power and perfection. The Allies had come to destroy an army and a government. But what they found in those garages was evidence of an entire worldview, one that equated technology with destiny, design with authority. By capturing those cars, they had captured more than machines. They had seized the mythology of modernity itself. For the soldiers who witnessed it firsthand, the memories never fully left. Some would later describe the surreal quiet of walking through a storage hall filled with polished vehicles, the smell of oil and dust lingering in the air. Others recalled the eerie beauty of headlights glinting in darkness, as if the machines were still waiting for orders that would never come. In those moments, history felt tangible, not a set of ideas, but an arrangement of steel and glass, perfectly preserved and utterly lifeless. When we look back now, from the vantage point of peace and hindsight, those captured cars remind us how closely art and ideology can intertwine. A car can embody freedom or control, individuality or obedience, depending on the hand that builds it and the mind that drives it. The Allies, in uncovering the automotive treasures of Nazi Germany, uncovered that truth as well. They learned that the same imagination capable of beauty can also be bent toward domination, that progress without conscience is merely acceleration without direction. The garages of the Reich are gone now, the factories rebuilt, the roads repaved, the ideologies buried under the weight of remembrance. But the photographs remain, soldiers standing beside strange, silent vehicles, the sunlight glinting off fenders designed for glory and found in defeat. Those images capture a moment when the world stood between eras, the end of one age of machines and the uncertain beginning of another. And so, the story of the captured cars is not just about technology or war. It is about what happens when human ingenuity is used to serve illusion, when beauty becomes an accessory to power. The Allies found more than engines and blueprints in those Nazi garages. They found a mirror showing both the heights and depths of modern civilization. What they carried home was not just knowledge, but a warning. Because even the most magnificent machine, stripped of purpose, eventually becomes only metal, gleaming, empty, and silent. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the flow of captured machines turned into a torrent. Trains and ships carried them across oceans and borders. Convoys of flatbeds stacked with strange silhouettes under tarps, bound for testing grounds in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, mechanics and engineers uncrated entire German half-tracks, armored cars, and the occasional sleek prototype. Their parts were measured, catalogued, tested, and sometimes driven across the fields by men who marveled at the precision of their design. For those accustomed to the heavier, more utilitarian American approach, there was something almost delicate about the German touch. The careful welding seams, the tight tolerances, the craftsmanship that survived even the chaos of defeat. Yet as they dismantled these machines, they also saw the contradictions of the regime that made them. Brilliance and cruelty interlocked in every bolt. In England, similar scenes unfolded. Engineers at the Ministry of Supply opened crates containing captured engines and transmissions, often still bearing the eagle insignia of the Reich. At Farnborough, test drivers took experimental German vehicles onto airfield tarmacs, evaluating suspension, power, and maneuverability. One noted in a report that a particular staff car, a Mercedes 770K, once reserved for senior officials, handled with an ease and quietness that belied its size. He made no mention of who might have ridden in it, or of the flags that once fluttered from its fenders. The focus was on the machine itself, stripped of ideology, reduced to geometry, steel, and motion. It was easier that way. Among the Allied nations there was also competition, quiet but real, over who would claim the spoils of German engineering. The Americans wanted data, the British wanted prestige, the Soviets wanted anything that could be replicated. From aircraft to tanks, every captured specimen was studied, and the cars were no exception. The Volkswagen factory, almost flattened, was now in the British zone, and thus became a prize of its own kind. Ivan Hurst, the British officer tasked with assessing it, found not only damaged machinery but crates of parts, fenders, axles, engines, all labeled with the unmistakable code of the KDF wagon. What he did next would change automotive history. Hurst recognized the potential. With Germany in ruins and transportation nearly impossible, he restarted the factory, employing German workers under Allied supervision. The product was no longer the people's car of Hitler's dream, but simply the Volkswagen, a practical, sturdy vehicle for a shattered nation. From those same molds and designs born in dictatorship, something entirely different emerged, a tool of reconstruction. The Allies had captured not just cars, but the blueprint for a post-war industry that would help rebuild Europe. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, American soldiers returning home told stories about the vehicles they had seen in Germany. Some remembered driving staff cars down the Autobahn. Others recalled stumbling upon barns filled with prototypes, the kind of stories that later drifted into legend. In post-war car clubs, these tales became currency. "I drove one of Hitler's cars," someone might claim, or "we found a Porsche prototype in an old factory." The truth often blurred with time, but the fascination never faded. As Europe began to rebuild, the ruins of Nazi garages slowly emptied. Many of the captured cars disappeared into private hands. Allied officers, allowed to claim small trophies before returning home, occasionally chose vehicles instead of paintings or silverware. In the late 1940s, American military ports briefly became showcases of exotic machinery. Mercedes staff cars, Porsche limousines, BMW coupes, all loaded onto ships bound for ports like New York or Baltimore. A few were resold, repainted, and quietly circulated through civilian life. Some survived into the present, restored and displayed with careful neutrality, their histories described with understatement. Others vanished entirely, broken down for parts or lost to scrapyards before anyone realized their significance. But not all of the captured cars were trophies. Some were ghosts. In factories like Maybach and Adler, Allied investigators discovered vehicles that had never been recorded. Prototypes for armored carriers, advanced engines, even crude experiments with hybrid electric drives. Many were photographed once, tagged, and then dismantled. Their documentation disappeared into archives, their existence remembered only in fragments of reports. These were machines conceived at the very edge of collapse, designed for a future that never came. Among these discoveries, perhaps the most poignant were the cars hidden by civilians. In the countryside, Allied patrols sometimes found luxury vehicles walled up in barns or buried beneath hay bales. Farmers and townspeople had concealed them during the bombings, sometimes for their value, sometimes because they symbolized a world that had once seemed untouchable. When the Allies found them, they were often covered in dust and cobwebs, tires flat, paint dulled by years of neglect. The engines might still turn, though. A reminder that even in the ashes, something of the old world survived. For the German civilians who watched as these vehicles were towed away, the moment was bittersweet. The cars had once embodied pride, wealth, and technological triumph. Now they were relics, claimed by the victors. For many Germans, the sight of an Allied officer driving away in a staff car once reserved for a party leader was more than irony. It was a visible symbol of reversal. The empire that had paraded these machines down the boulevards of Berlin was gone, its symbols commandeered, its engines carrying new passengers. Yet even in defeat, German engineering left its imprint on those who studied it. Allied technicians learned from the vehicles they captured. Suspension systems, precision fuel injection, and lightweight alloys. All found their way into later designs. The American automobile industry, already vast, integrated lessons from these discoveries into its understanding of efficiency and handling. British manufacturers observed the compact yet robust designs of cars like the Volkswagen and adapted some of the same principles for their post-war vehicles. Even the Soviet Union, which captured whole convoys of German equipment, used what they found as the foundation for their own automotive programs. In time, what began as plunder became influence. The ideas embedded in those captured cars spread far beyond the ruins of the Reich. They appeared subtly transformed, in the shape of dashboards, the curvature of hoods, the balance between function and form. In a sense, the Allies did not merely take the machines. They absorbed them. As the decades passed, the memory of those discoveries faded from public conversation, though never entirely from history. A few of the captured cars survived in museums, labeled with cautious phrasing, Staff Car, Germany, 1943, or Prototype, captured near Stuttgart. The word Nazi was seldom used in the descriptions. It seemed easier to let the machines exist apart from the ideology that built them. Yet the shadow remained. Visitors gazing at those cars saw more than polished chrome. They saw contradiction, beauty born of brutality, perfection built for destruction. In the 1950s and 60s, as Germany rebuilt itself under democracy, the story took a quieter turn. Many of the engineers who had once designed for the Reich now worked for new companies under new leadership. Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen rose from the ashes, their factories rebuilt, their names cleansed. The cars that rolled out of these plants bore little visible trace of their wartime past, but the lineage was there, invisible, mechanical, undeniable. The lessons of design and efficiency honed in the crucible of war had become the backbone of a new industry, dedicated not to conquest, but to commerce. In Allied countries, few reflected deeply on the captured vehicles once the world moved on. They became curiosities for collectors, fragments of a strange intersection between technology and ideology. Yet among veterans and historians, the memory persisted. Some recalled their first encounters with German cars, not with anger, but with awe. They remembered the hum of precision, the weight of doors that closed with mechanical confidence, the strange beauty of machines that had outlived their masters. It is easy to imagine that the Allies only captured steel and rubber, but in truth they captured something more abstract, a philosophy of engineering that prized precision, endurance, and control. It was a philosophy tainted by its origins, yet powerful enough to transcend them. Over time, it became woven into the post-war fabric of global industry, filtered and reshaped through peace. There were moments, too, when the legacy of these captured cars turned symbolic once more. In the 1960s, as the Volkswagen Beetle became a worldwide icon, beloved, cheerful, and unthreatening, few remembered that its lineage traced back to a project conceived under the Nazi banner. What had once been propaganda became nostalgia. What had once symbolized control now represented freedom. The transformation was complete, but the irony remained. By the late 20th century, collectors and historians began to trace the fates of those captured cars more carefully. Some turned up in barns in rural England or garages in France, still bearing faded insignias beneath layers of paint. Others appeared in private collections in America, their histories obscured by decades of silence. Each rediscovery was like unearthing a time capsule, a machine that had survived both war and forgetting. For those who restored them, the process was delicate. To bring such a vehicle back to life was to touch history directly, to feel the tension between craftsmanship and ideology under one's hands. And so the story of the captured enemy cars became more than a footnote in the chronicles of war. It became a mirror, a way to see how technology reflects its creators, how a civilization's values and ambitions are etched into its machines. The Allies, who walked through those Nazi garages in 1945, could not have known how enduring the influence of their discoveries would be. To them, the cars were trophies, curiosities, evidence of a defeated enemy's ingenuity. But in time, those same machines, or what they represented, would shape the post-war world in ways they never imagined. When we look at the photographs today, the Allied soldiers standing beside polished Mercedes staff cars, the lines of dusty vehicles in bombed-out depots, the engineers bending over engines with notebooks in hand, we see more than mechanical recovery. We see a world reckoning with its own contradictions. In those garages, the Allies found not only the remnants of an empire, but the reflection of their own future, one in which technology would define progress, power, and even identity. The captured cars remind us that history often travels in unexpected directions. Machines built for tyranny can, in time, serve peace. Designs born in arrogance can become symbols of endurance. And even in the ruins of war, there are moments when the human urge to create, to perfect, to understand, to build, outlasts the ideologies that try to control it. In the end, what the Allies found in those garages was not just evidence of defeat or triumph, but a glimpse of continuity, the realization that progress, once unleashed, cannot be contained by flags or borders. The cars were silent witnesses to both the folly and brilliance of their age, each one a paradox on wheels. They told a story without speaking, their engines still warm from a vanished world, waiting to be heard by those who knew how to listen.